On June 25, 1876, one soldier witnessed General Custer's final moments. What secret did he carry to his grave? What caused an entire army to crumble before the storm on the plains? Uncover the story of Through the Dust and Smoke. In the spring of 1876, the Montana Territory was a land of whispers and warnings, its vast plains stretching like an endless canvas under a sky that seemed to hold its breath. For Theodore W. Golden, a weathered trooper of the 7th Cavalry, the air carried the weight of something momentous. Having enlisted in 1873, he had ridden through dust and danger under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a man whose name was synonymous with both glory and recklessness. Now, as the 7th Cavalry marched from Fort Lincoln in the Dakota Territory, Golden sensed a storm brewing, not in the clouds, but in the hearts of men and the clash of worlds. The expedition was part of a grand plan to subdue the Sioux, who had defied the U.S. government's demands to confine themselves to reservations. 3 military columns, led by Generals Terry, Gibbon, and Crook, were to converge on the tribes, their combined might intended to crush resistance. Golden's battalion, fresh from a posting in Shreveport, Louisiana, arrived at Fort Lincoln to find Custer delayed, entangled in a political scandal in Washington. His testimony before a congressional committee had earned him President Grant's ire, and he rejoined the regiment only days before their departure, his usual fire tempered by a shadow of frustration. The march from Fort Lincoln was grueling, a relentless trek through rugged terrain toward the Rosebud River. Custer, reinvigorated by the prospect of battle, rode at the head of the column, his golden curls catching the sunlight, his energy infectious. Golden, riding among the ranks, felt the familiar rhythm of campaign life, the creak of saddles, the jingle of spurs, the low murmur of men who knew hardship but trusted their leader. Yet, there were whispers among the troopers. The Sioux, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, were no ordinary foe. Scouts spoke of a massive encampment, a gathering of tribes unprecedented in its scale. Golden, who had seen Custer's daring win battles before, wondered if this time the general's ambition might outstrip his judgment. On June 21, the 7th Cavalry reached the Yellowstone River, where General Terry's supply steamer, the Far West, awaited. A war council was held aboard the vessel, its cramped cabin filled with the tense voices of Terry, Gibbon, and Custer. Golden, standing guard outside, caught fragments of the discussion through the open door. Custer was offered reinforcements, a 2nd Cavalry battalion and artillery, but he declined, citing confidence in his regiment and concerns that artillery would slow them down. The decision raised eyebrows among the men. "He wants the glory all to himself," muttered a grizzled sergeant beside Golden, his words heavy with both admiration and unease. The council concluded with clear orders. Custer was to follow the Indian trail discovered by Major Reno, engage the enemy, and prevent their escape until Gibbon's column arrived, no sooner than noon on June 26. As the meeting broke, Golden overheard Gibbon's parting words to Custer, "Don't be greedy, George. Wait for us." Custer's reply was a confident grin, but Golden, watching from the shadows, saw a flicker of something else, perhaps defiance, perhaps desperation to reclaim his tarnished reputation after Washington's humiliation. On June 22, the 7th Cavalry set out, following the trail with a relentless pace. The men rode through the night, their horses' hooves kicking up dust that clung to their sweat-soaked uniforms. Golden, assigned to Custer's staff as an orderly, rode close to the general, noting his restless intensity. The trail, marked by signs of a large native force, led toward the Little Bighorn Valley. Crow and Ree scouts, led by Bloody Knife, estimated the enemy at 1,000 to 1,200 warriors, a formidable but manageable number. Yet, as the column pressed on, Golden felt a growing unease. The trail was too fresh, too wide, hinting at a force far larger than anticipated. By the evening of June 24, the regiment halted near the Rosebud's mouth, but it was a ruse. Custer ordered the men to stay saddled, ready for a nighttime advance to conceal their movements. Golden, checking his horse's tack, caught sight of Custer pacing under the stars, his silhouette sharp against the campfire's glow. The general's focus was absolute, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy waited. "We'll find them tomorrow," he told his officers, his voice carrying a certainty that brooked no doubt. But Golden, lying on the hard ground, his carbine at his side, couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding into something greater than glory, a destiny woven in dust and smoke. As dawn approached, the column prepared to cross the divide into the Little Bighorn Valley. Golden, gripping his reins, felt the weight of the moment. The sacred lands of the Sioux, the ambition of Custer, and the fragile hope of survival were about to collide. The plains stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, and in the distance, the faint heartbeat of drums seemed to echo from the valley below. The dawn of June 25, 1876, broke over the Montana Territory with a deceptive calm, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the dew-soaked grass of the Little Bighorn Valley. Theodore W. Golden, a trooper of the 7th Cavalry, felt the weight of exhaustion in his bones as the regiment pressed forward after a grueling night march. The men, their faces etched with dust and resolve, rode in tight formation behind Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, whose restless energy seemed to pull the column toward an unseen destiny. Golden, assigned as an orderly to Custer's staff, rode close to the general, his senses sharpened by the growing certainty that the day would bring fire and blood. The trail they followed, marked by the wide swath of a massive native encampment, led over a rugged divide toward the Little Bighorn River. The Crow and Ree scouts, led by Bloody Knife, had ridden ahead, their reports growing more urgent with each mile. From a high ridge, they spotted the distant smoke of campfires and the sprawling outline of a village, a gathering far larger than the 1,000 warriors they had estimated. Golden overheard their warnings to Custer, delivered in hushed, urgent tones. The valley held a force that dwarfed their own. But Custer, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase, dismissed their concerns. "We've caught them napping," he declared, his voice ringing with confidence. Golden, clutching his carbine, felt a chill despite the morning heat. The general's bravado was familiar, but the stakes felt different this time. As the column descended into the valley, the terrain grew treacherous, gullies and cliffs slowed their progress, and the men struggled to keep formation. Golden, riding near Lieutenant William Cook, the regiment's adjutant, noted the tension among the officers. Orders were given to divide the command. Major Marcus Reno was to take 3 companies and attack the southern end of the village, Captain Frederick Benteen was sent to scout the left flank, and Custer would lead 5 companies directly toward the heart of the encampment. McDougall's company trailed behind, guarding the pack train. The fragmentation of the regiment, without reconnaissance or reliable intelligence, struck Golden as reckless. He exchanged a glance with a fellow trooper, their unspoken fears mirrored in each other's eyes. Around 11 a.m., as the column paused in a gully beneath towering cliffs, signs of detection emerged. A recovery detail, sent to retrieve a misplaced ammunition crate, stumbled upon native scouts examining it. The discovery electrified Custer. "They're running," he exclaimed, misreading the signs as evidence of a retreating enemy. Golden, tasked with carrying messages for Cook, felt the pace quicken. The general ordered an immediate advance, and the trumpets sounded, their shrill notes cutting through the morning air. The column surged forward, horses snorting, men gripping their reins as they raced toward the river. Golden's heart pounded as he rode, the dust rising like a veil around them. He glimpsed Custer galloping ahead, hat in hand, waving as if greeting distant figures. The general's excitement was contagious, yet Golden couldn't shake the warnings of Mitch Bouillet, the mixed-blood Crow interpreter. "General," Bouillet had said, his voice steady but grave, "that village holds more warriors than we can fight. If we go down there, we'll all die." Custer's response was a sharp rebuke, questioning Bouillet's courage. The scout, unyielding, replied, "I'll follow you anywhere, but it's death in that valley." Golden, overhearing, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The prophecy of doom lingered like smoke. As Custer's 5 companies veered right, paralleling Reno's advance, the village came into view, a vast sea of teepees stretching along the river, alive with movement. Golden, riding near Cook, saw the general's face harden with determination. "The hostiles are in retreat," Custer told Captain Miles Keogh, whose battle-hardened troop led the vanguard. "If we press hard, we'll run them down." Keogh, his expression unreadable, surveyed his men and replied, "General, we'll give everything these men and mounts have." The order to charge rang out, and the column thundered northward, attempting to ford the river at several points but finding the banks too steep. After a third failed crossing, Custer halted briefly, conferring with Cook. Golden, standing ready, watched as Cook scribbled a message on his notepad. "Take this to Major Reno," Cook ordered, handing Golden the folded paper. "Stay with his unit until we reunite, then report back." Before Golden could respond, the column surged forward, disappearing into a network of gullies. Alone in enemy territory, Golden spurred his horse toward Reno's position, guided by the dust cloud rising from their advance. Distant shots echoed, urging him to ride faster, his pulse racing as he navigated the uneven terrain. After a grueling 6-mile ride, Golden reached Reno's detachment as they dismounted to form skirmish lines. Handing over the dispatch, he saw Reno scan it briefly before tucking it away. The situation was already unraveling, scouts were fleeing in panic, and warriors were emerging from the village, their numbers overwhelming. Reno's men, caught in the open, faced a torrent of arrows and gunfire. Golden, caught in the chaos, joined the skirmish, firing his carbine as the line wavered. The warriors, moving with terrifying precision, began to encircle them, forcing a desperate retreat toward a wooded area by the river. As Golden fought to keep pace, he saw the first signs of collapse. Horses bolted, men fell, and the air filled with the cries of the wounded. The timber offered temporary cover, but the situation was dire. Reno, his face pale, ordered a withdrawal to the bluffs across the river, a move that quickly became a rout. Golden, gripping his reins, rode through the chaos, his mind racing with the realization that Custer's column, somewhere downstream, was likely facing the same overwhelming odds. The valley, once serene, was now a crucible of fire and smoke, and Golden knew the day was far from over. The Little Bighorn Valley, on the afternoon of June 25, 1876, was a cauldron of chaos, its air thick with dust, smoke, and the screams of men and horses. Theodore W. Golden, a trooper of the 7th Cavalry, clung to the edge of survival as Major Marcus Reno's detachment scrambled for cover in the timber along the river. The warriors of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, their war cries piercing the din, pressed their attack with relentless precision. Golden, his carbine hot in his hands, fired blindly into the haze, his heart pounding as the reality of their predicament sank in. The 7th Cavalry, divided and outnumbered, was fighting for its life, and somewhere downstream, Custer's fate hung in the balance. The retreat to the timber had been a desperate bid for survival. Reno's men, overwhelmed by the sheer number of warriors, had abandoned their skirmish lines, their formation crumbling under a hail of arrows and bullets. Golden, caught in the chaos, had barely reached the wooded cover, his horse lathered and trembling. The trees offered a fleeting refuge, their branches shielding the men as they reloaded and returned fire. But the warriors, moving like shadows, pressed closer, their gunfire snapping through the leaves. Golden saw men fall, some clutching wounds, others motionless, their eyes staring blankly at the sky. Reno, his face taut with strain, barked orders to reorganize. Golden, still carrying the message he'd delivered from Custer, stayed close to Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, who was rallying his men. The situation grew dire as warriors began to flank the timber, their movements swift and coordinated. Golden overheard Captain French, commanding the central unit, shout to Lieutenant Wallace, "No orders yet, but we can't stay here." Moments later, French relayed a grim command, "Prepare for a mounted assault." But as the men moved to their horses, the truth became clear. Reno was ordering a withdrawal across the river to the bluffs, a desperate attempt to escape the tightening noose. The retreat was a nightmare. Golden mounted his horse, only to feel it collapse beneath him, struck by a bullet. Thrown into a patch of sagebrush, he scrambled to his feet, his uniform torn but his body miraculously unscathed. Lieutenant Wallace galloped past, shouting, "To the trees, Golden," as the column surged toward the river. Golden sprinted for cover, his breath ragged, dodging stray shots that kicked up dirt around him. From the timber, he watched the chaos unfold, troopers driving their horses through the treacherous river crossing, some falling as warriors fired from the banks. Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson, wounded and struggling, clung to another soldier's saddle strap as his horse plunged into the water. Golden, peering through the smoke, saw Hodgson reach the far bank, his face pale with pain. As a comrade tried to pull him up, another shot rang out, and Hodgson's grip faltered. He staggered upright, drawing his sidearm and firing defiantly at his pursuers before collapsing, his body crumpling to the earth. Golden, frozen in his hiding place, felt a pang of helplessness. The valley was swallowing them, one by one. The warriors, their focus shifting, began to move downstream, drawn by the distant crackle of gunfire. Golden realized with dread that Custer's column was engaged, facing the same overwhelming odds. Alone in the timber, he spotted Scout George Herendeen nearby and signaled to him. Herendeen, his face grim, reported that 15 dismounted troopers were trapped deeper in the woods, cut off by accurate enemy fire. The warriors, unaware of Golden's presence, were preoccupied with plundering the fallen along the river's edge, their knives flashing as they took trophies from the dead. A sudden plume of smoke rose as the warriors set fire to the riverside brush, either to mask their movements or flush out survivors. The smoke became Golden's salvation, cloaking his desperate dash across the river. Wading through the current, he joined Herendeen and the stranded troopers, guided by a Crow scout to the remnants of Reno's command on the bluffs. There, Captain Benteen's battalion had arrived, reinforcing the survivors. But no word came from Custer, and the distant gunfire grew sporadic, then silent. Golden, catching his breath, felt a sinking dread. The general's column was gone. On the bluffs, the men dug in, improvising breastworks from sagebrush and dirt. Golden, now part of a makeshift defensive line, fired at shadows in the valley below. Captain Weir, frustrated by the lack of action, declared, "If you won't advance, I'll go alone." He stormed off, leading his troop toward the distant gunfire without orders. The command followed, but they were quickly driven back by overwhelming numbers. Golden, positioned near Lieutenant Wallace, heard Benteen take charge, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Wallace, anchor your flank here," Benteen ordered. Wallace, with a bleak smile, replied, "I've no troop left, just 2 men." Benteen's grim chuckle was a fleeting moment of humanity amid the carnage. As night fell, the survivors consolidated their perimeter, digging trenches and tending to the wounded. Golden, his hands blistered from firing, helped carry a trooper to the makeshift field hospital. The warriors' attacks paused under cover of darkness, but the silence was heavy with fear. The men whispered of Custer's fate, their voices low as if speaking too loudly might summon the enemy back. Golden, staring into the starlit valley, replayed the day's horrors, Hodgson's defiant stand, the smoke-filled retreat, the eerie quiet where Custer's men had vanished. The Little Bighorn had become a valley of death, and Golden, one of its few witnesses, knew the worst was yet to come. The night of June 25, 1876, cloaked the Little Bighorn Valley in an uneasy stillness, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant howls of coyotes. Theodore W. Golden, a trooper of the 7th Cavalry, crouched behind a makeshift breastwork of sagebrush and dirt on the bluffs overlooking the river. The survivors of Major Marcus Reno's and Captain Frederick Benteen's battalions, now united, clung to their precarious position, their eyes scanning the darkness for signs of the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who had decimated their comrades. Golden, his hands raw from digging trenches with a tin cup, felt the weight of exhaustion and fear, tempered by a grim resolve to survive. The silence from Custer's column downstream was a wound as raw as the bullet grazes on his arm. The bluffs, a jagged ridge offering sparse cover, had become a fortress of desperation. The men, fewer than 400 now, worked feverishly under Benteen's command to fortify their position. Golden, assigned to a defensive line near Lieutenant George Wallace, piled rocks and earth alongside his comrades, their faces ghostly in the moonlight. The wounded, sprawled in a makeshift hospital corral, moaned as surgeons worked by lantern light, their tools slick with blood. Golden caught sight of Trooper Madden from K Company, his leg shattered by a bullet, awaiting amputation. The man's stoic silence, broken only by a faint grimace, was a testament to the grim courage binding the survivors. As dawn broke on June 26, the warriors returned, their war cries shattering the morning calm. Golden, peering over the breastwork, saw them moving like a tide across the valley, their painted horses weaving through the grass. The attack came in waves, arrows hissing through the air, bullets splintering the makeshift defenses. Golden fired his carbine until the barrel burned his hands, each shot a prayer for survival. The warriors, emboldened by their victory over Custer, struck with relentless precision, their numbers seeming inexhaustible. "There's thousands of them," muttered a trooper beside Golden, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Golden, reloading, could only nod, his mind flashing to Mitch Bouillet's warning, "That valley holds more warriors than we can fight." Benteen, now the de facto commander, moved among the men, his calm authority a lifeline in the chaos. Golden overheard him rallying Lieutenant Edgerly, "Hold this flank, no matter the cost. We're all that's left." Edgerly, his face streaked with dirt, nodded grimly. The defense held, but at a cost. Men fell, their bodies dragged to the corral, their carbines passed to others. Golden, positioned near the center, saw Captain Weir, still seething from the previous day's retreat, lead a small counterattack to repel warriors creeping up the bluffs. The effort bought precious time, but Weir's men returned bloodied, their numbers dwindling. Water became a desperate need as the sun climbed higher, baking the bluffs. The river, tantalizingly close, was a gauntlet of enemy fire. Twice, volunteers risked runs to fill canteens, drawing a hail of bullets. During the second attempt, Golden watched in horror as Trooper Madden, already wounded, was struck again, his sacrifice ensuring water for the wounded. Golden, clutching a canteen, helped carry Madden to the surgeons, his heart heavy with the futility of their stand. The warriors, sensing victory, pressed harder, their shouts echoing like a storm. By mid-afternoon, a sudden shift occurred. Golden, squinting through the dust, saw the warriors begin to strike their lodges, their camp dissolving into a stream of movement upriver. The reason was unclear, perhaps they feared reinforcements, perhaps their victory was enough. The firing slackened, then ceased, leaving an eerie silence. Golden, his ears ringing, scanned the valley, half expecting another assault. Instead, he saw only the smoke of burning grass and the distant figures of departing warriors, their silhouettes fading into the hills. The survivors, battered and weary, held their breath, unsure if the reprieve was a trap. Benteen ordered the men to strengthen the defenses, fearing a night attack. Golden, helping to dig trenches, overheard whispered speculations about Custer's fate. "They're gone," a sergeant muttered, his voice hollow. "All of them." Golden, his mind replaying the distant gunfire from the previous day, felt a chill. The general's reckless charge, his refusal of reinforcements, his dismissal of the scouts' warnings, all had led to this. Yet, Golden couldn't shake the image of Custer waving his hat atop the outcrop, his confidence unshaken even in the face of doom. As night fell, the men tended to their wounded, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Golden, sitting by a small fire, cleaned his carbine, his thoughts drifting to the comrades lost, Hodgson, McIntosh, the countless others whose names blurred in the haze of battle. The bluffs, once a refuge, now felt like a graveyard, each rock and trench a marker of their ordeal. The arrival of General Terry's and Gibbon's columns the next day, June 27, brought confirmation of the worst. Scouts reported Custer's command annihilated, their bodies scattered across a hill downstream. Golden, hearing the news, felt a hollow ache. The valley, sacred to the Sioux, had claimed its price in blood. The survivors, under Terry's orders, began the grim task of evacuating the wounded and burying the dead. Golden, crossing the river with a burial detail, saw the aftermath, bodies stripped and mutilated, a stark contrast to Custer's, left largely untouched in a gesture of respect. The scene, under the harsh Montana sun, was a tableau of tragedy, a testament to the clash of worlds. Golden, shovel in hand, buried a comrade, his mind heavy with the question that would haunt him for years: how had it come to this? The morning of June 27, 1876, dawned over the little Bighorn Valley with a heavy stillness, as if the land itself mourned the blood spilled upon it. Theodore W. Golden, a weary trooper of the 7th Cavalry, stood among the survivors on the bluffs, his eyes tracing the smoke curling from the valley below. The arrival of General Alfred Terry's and General John Gibbon's columns brought a fleeting sense of relief, but it was overshadowed by the grim task ahead, to uncover the fate of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his men. Golden, his uniform torn and his hands blistered from 2 days of fighting, felt the weight of survival as both a blessing and a burden. The valley, once a battlefield, was now a graveyard, its secrets etched in the earth. As Terry's men descended into the valley, Golden joined a burial detail, crossing the Little Bighorn River to the hill where Custer's command had made its final stand. The sight was a gut punch. Bodies of troopers lay strewn across the slope, their blue coats stained with blood and dust. Custer himself was found on what would later be called Last Stand Hill, lying beside his brothers Tom and Boston, his nephew Harry Reed, and his brother-in-law James Calhoun. 2 bullet wounds, one near his heart, another at his temple, marked his end, yet his body was largely untouched, a rare gesture of respect from the victorious warriors. Golden, shovel in hand, paused, struck by the general's serene expression, as if death had frozen his defiance. He went down fighting, a sergeant muttered nearby, and Golden nodded, though his mind churned with questions about the choices that led to this slaughter. The burial was a grim necessity, hastened by the summer heat. Golden and his comrades dug shallow graves where the fallen lay, marking them with crude wooden stakes. Each body told a story, a trooper clutching a broken carbine, another gripping a locket with a faded photograph. Golden, burying a man he'd shared a campfire with days before, felt a pang of guilt for surviving when so many had not. The warrior's ferocity, guided by leaders like Crazy Horse and fueled by Sitting Bull's vision, had been unlike anything he'd witnessed. The Lakota and Cheyenne had fought not just for victory but for their way of life, a truth that gnawed at Golden as he worked under the relentless sun. The survivors, now under Terry's command, evacuated the wounded across the river, their makeshift stretchers swaying with each step. Golden helped carry Trooper Madden, whose leg had been amputated the previous night, his face pale but resolute. The Far West steamer, waiting downstream, became a floating hospital, its deck crowded with moaning men. As Golden boarded to assist, he overheard Terry dictating a report. "It is my painful duty to report that Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his entire immediate command have been annihilated." The words, stark and final, hung in the air like a death knell. Golden, staring at the river's glassy surface, felt the enormity of the loss settle into his bones. The news reached the East like a wildfire, igniting shock and outrage during America's centennial celebrations. Newspapers screamed of Custer's last stand, transforming the flamboyant general into a martyr. The New York Herald's bold headlines and the Chicago Tribune's tearful biographies fueled public fury, painting the native warriors as savages. Golden, years later, would reflect on the irony. The Lakota and Cheyenne had fought with a unity and brilliance the army had underestimated, their victory a testament to their resolve rather than barbarity. Yet, the nation, humiliated, demanded vengeance. Congress called for more troops, and President Grant, pressured by public outcry, deployed reinforcements to the Dakota Territory. For the tribes, the victory at Little Bighorn was a fleeting triumph. Golden, in conversations with frontier veterans years later, learned of the relentless pursuit that followed. General Nelson Miles' winter campaigns hunted the Lakota and Cheyenne, starving them as buffalo herds vanished. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, Crazy Horse surrendered, and the Great Coalition dissolved under the weight of hunger and loss. Reservation life, with its rations and restrictions, crushed the spirit of the plains. The Ghost Dance movement, a desperate bid to reclaim their past, ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890. Golden, haunted by the faces of the warriors he'd glimpsed in battle, saw their victory as a sacred fire that burned brightly but briefly. In the years that followed, Golden wrestled with the battle's legacy. He penned his recollections in 1904, responding to a historian's inquiry, his words a bridge between memory and truth. He wrote of Custer's bravery, bordering on recklessness, and the critical failures that doomed the 7th Cavalry, the fragmentation of the command, the premature advance, the loss of mounts and ammunition. He speculated that Custer's defiance of orders stemmed from a need to redeem his tarnished reputation after Washington's censure, a gamble for glory that cost hundreds of lives. Yet, Golden also acknowledged the general's valor, his final moments spent fighting alongside his men, as honorable as his victories at Washita. The Little Bighorn became a myth, its story retold in paintings, books, and campfire tales. For Golden, it was no myth but a wound that never fully healed. The valley, sacred to the Sioux, had claimed its toll, reshaping a nation and its frontier. As he laid down his pen in 1904, Golden saw the faces of his fallen comrades, Hodgson, McIntosh, Custer, etched in the dust and smoke of memory. The battle, a clash of courage and tragedy, remained a testament to the cost of ambition and the resilience of a people fighting for their way of life. For Golden, it was a story he carried to his grave, a soldier's truth forged in the crucible of Little Bighorn.